The glittering chandeliers of Versailles blazed like captured stars, their golden light spilling across polished marble floors. Courtiers in silks and brocades glided through the hall of mirrors, their faces powdered, their voices laced with wit and venom alike. At the very centre of this magnificent spectacle stood King Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, resplendent in embroidered finery, his presence radiant, his gaze commanding. France, in the late 17th century, basked in his brilliance. His court was the stage upon which all of Europe looked in envy. Yet behind the perfume and powdered wigs, a darker perfume lingered, one not of roses and amber, but of sulphur, blood, and betrayal. For beneath the gilded ceilings of Versailles, whispers spread like smoke. Whispers of witchcraft, poisons, and secret rites conducted in the dead of night. The very foundations of Louis's court, built on pageantry and loyalty, trembled under rumours of the unspeakable. What could possibly tarnish the brilliance of the Sun King? The answer began, innocuously enough, with one woman. Catherine Montespan, known to history simply as La Voisin, a fortune-teller and midwife in Paris, whose reputation extended far beyond the narrow alleys of her district. To the desperate wives of noblemen, she offered potions to secure love, or charms to ensure fidelity. To those who sought darker favours, she whispered of powders, draughts, and poisons delivered in secrecy, promising freedom from rivals, husbands, or inconvenient heirs. In an age when appearances mattered more than truth, the court was rife with ambition. Mistresses competed for the king's attention, nobles jostled for position, and marriages were shackles more often than bonds. La Voisin's services found eager patrons. At first, they came quietly, women of lesser houses, merchants' wives, even priests who sought her counsel. But soon, her clientele would include the highest ladies of the realm, including those who dined in the presence of the Sun King himself. By the late 1672, whispers of sudden deaths began to haunt Paris. Husbands who collapsed after supper, rivals who wasted away, infants who perished in their cradles. The line between superstition and reality blurred, but one thing was certain: death had become an instrument of ambition. And the epicentre of this shadowy commerce was La Voisin's modest house. The scandal might have remained in the underbelly of Paris, had it not touched the gilded circle of Versailles itself. When suspicion reached Madame de Montespan, the king's own mistress, the affair transformed from rumour to crisis. For Montespan was no mere courtesan. She was the mother of the king's children, a woman of wit, fire, and unyielding ambition. If she had sought La Voisin's services, whether in desperate love spells to bind Louis to her, or in darker rituals to eliminate her rivals, then the scandal did not simply threaten reputations. It threatened the very legitimacy of the monarchy. And so, in 1677, the veil began to lift. The police chief of Paris, Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie, received word of the poisoner's trade. What began as a handful of arrests soon unravelled into a vast network. Apothecaries, alchemists, priests defrocked and disgraced, women who claimed to summon demons, and noblemen whose titles could not shield them from suspicion. What they uncovered would shake the kingdom to its core. This was not merely crime, it was conspiracy. A France intoxicated by perfumes and splendour now found itself choking on the fumes of death. And so the question lingers for us today. How could the most brilliant court of Europe, under the radiant Sun King, also be the breeding ground for shadows so dark they threatened to consume the throne itself? The affair of the poisons had begun, and it would end only in fire, blood, and the cries of the condemned echoing through the streets of Paris. In the smoky back rooms of Paris, where velvet curtains muffled the cries of infants, and the laughter of drunkards spilled from taverns, a woman sat at the heart of a web that stretched into the highest reaches of France. Catherine Montespan La Voisin was not beautiful, not noble, and not powerful by any traditional measure. Yet in the world of whispered fears and forbidden desires, she became indispensable. Clients came to her door, cloaked in secrecy. Some wanted powders to rekindle a husband's passion. Others sought herbs to end an unwanted pregnancy. A few came with darker intentions, asking for something stronger, something that could silence a rival forever. La Voisin gave them what they sought, her hands steady, her eyes unreadable. She was a midwife of life and death alike. Her home became a sanctuary for the discontented and ambitious. Behind her walls, the boundaries of morality blurred. Priests, stripped of their vows, offered black masses for desperate women. Infants, it was whispered, were sacrificed upon altars, their blood mixed into chalices of wine. Were these stories truth or invention? The line has always been thin, blurred by fear and gossip. Yet to contemporaries, the fear was real. To visit La Voisin was to stand at the threshold of heaven or hell, depending on what one dared to purchase. But La Voisin was not alone. She was part of a larger market of divineresses, fortune-tellers, alchemists, and charm makers who thrived in a society where superstition and faith coexisted uneasily. Astrology, potions, spells. These were not the practices of peasants alone. Nobles too, cloaked in lace and jewels, sought omens and elixirs. The desperation of a scorned wife in a cold Parisian garret was no different than that of a duchess at Versailles. Both longed for power they could not reach by birth or marriage. And so, coin by coin, secret by secret, La Voisin's network grew. Yet as her influence spread, so too did suspicion. The deaths piling up in Paris could not all be explained by illness or misfortune. The police began to notice patterns. Men collapsed suddenly at their tables, their skin blackened, their bodies writhing in torment. Women wasted away slowly, as if cursed. Nobles who should have been untouchable were struck down by the invisible hand of poison. It was murder without a blade, death without a duel, and it terrified the realm. What made the threat more chilling was the possibility that these poisons were not confined to the shadows of Paris. The tendrils of the network seemed to reach toward Versailles itself. Whispers claimed that love philters and spells were finding their way into the goblets of kings, that the bed of the monarch himself might not be free from the taint of sorcery. At the centre of these whispers stood Madame de Montespan, the king's mistress, clever, ambitious, and fiercely jealous. She had risen to prominence through charm and wit, securing Louis XIV's passion and bearing him children. But Versailles was a battlefield of silk and smiles, and rivals lurked everywhere. Montespan was determined never to be displaced. And so the question that history still struggles to answer arose. Did she, in her desperation, turn to La Voisin's dark services? Did the mistress of the Sun King stoop to spells, potions, and even black masses to keep his love bound to her? The evidence that would later emerge, candles blackened with blood, parchments scrawled with invocations, and testimony from trembling witnesses suggested a chilling possibility. Whether truth or invention, it was enough to ensnare Montespan in the net of suspicion. And so, in the late 1670s, La Voisin's trade transformed from shadowy whispers to a looming scandal. For what had begun as a fortune-teller's business in Paris now threatened to unravel the carefully spun fabric of Versailles. Behind the chandeliers and the powdered faces, a question lingered. If even the king's own mistress might be a client of poisoners, what protection did anyone have? The storm was gathering, and when it broke, it would not spare even those who dined at the table of the Sun King. Versailles gleamed like the very heart of the Sunday golden galleries, manicured gardens, fountains that seemed to defy gravity. This was the world Louis XIV had built to project his power, his immortality. But beneath the brilliance, a shadow stretched long across France. A shadow that even the Sun King could not ignore. For rumours of poison were no longer confined to the alleys of Paris. They had begun to coil their way around the very court itself. Enter Gabriel Nicolas de Lorraine, appointed in 1667 as the first Lieutenant General of Police of Paris. To many, he was little more than an administrator, tasked with organising street lamps, reducing crime, and taming the chaos of a city alive with merchants, beggars, and soldiers. But Lorraine's mind was sharp, his resolve iron, and when whispers of poison reached his ears, he recognised something far greater than petty crime. This was not just a series of murders, it was a conspiracy that threatened the very stability of the crown. His investigation began quietly. Informants were planted in taverns and gambling dens. Fortune-tellers were questioned, their words carefully recorded. And one by one, threads began to emerge. Bottles of suspicious powders, vials hidden in clothing, testimonies of midwives who had seen too much. At the centre of this tangled skein, the name of Lavoisin surfaced again and again. La Reynie understood the danger. To accuse a commoner of poisoning was simple. But when evidence suggested the involvement of nobles, ladies who attended Versailles, men with titles and influence, he faced a perilous choice. To pursue the truth meant risking scandal at the highest levels. To ignore it meant leaving the king vulnerable to unseen daggers dipped in venom. And then came the breakthrough. In 1679, a nobleman named Gaudin de Sainte Croix was found dead. Hidden among his possessions were boxes of powders, papers coded with secrets, and letters that revealed an underground trade in poisons. The network was undeniable. Names, recipes, payments, all written in ink that could not be erased. The scandal could no longer be dismissed as rumour. The revelations spread like wildfire. Suddenly, Paris was alive with fear. Husbands eyed their wives with suspicion. Servants whispered about their masters. Nobles began to wonder if their rivals' smiles hid murder in their cups. In every sudden illness, in every unexpected death, people saw the hand of poison. The very air seemed thick with paranoia. La Reynie pressed forward, his investigations relentless. Arrests multiplied, and torture chambers groaned under the confessions of the accused. Some spoke of potions brewed from deadly herbs. Others whispered of arsenic hidden in perfumed gloves or jewels. Still others confessed to things so monstrous they seemed impossible. Black masses where infants were sacrificed, where women of high birth begged priests to stain altars with blood in exchange for love or influence. Were all these confessions true, or were they twisted by fear and the agony of torture? History cannot always tell. But for La Reynie, the pattern was clear. A hidden underworld of poisoners and sorcerers had wormed its way into the glittering heart of France. And if it reached all the way to Madame de Montespan, the king's beloved mistress, then the Sun King himself was in peril. Louis XIV, proud and unshakable, could not allow his brilliance to be eclipsed by scandal. And yet, he could not turn away. If poison stalked his court, if those closest to him whispered incantations in the night, then the foundation of his reign was cracked. Thus, with the king's uneasy blessing, La Reynie's investigation deepened. Warrants were signed, suspects dragged from their beds, the dungeons filled with the cries of the accused. Versailles trembled, for the very people who had once toasted to the Sun King's health now feared that their own chalices might carry death. And in the shadows of Paris, Lavoisin watched, her web tightening around her, the flames of retribution drawing ever closer. The chill of winter clung to Paris in 1679 when the noose began to tighten. For years, Catherine Monvoisin Lavoisin had thrived in the shadows, her fortune-telling business a mask for darker trades. She had whispered comfort to the desperate, placed powders into trembling hands, and presided over rites that few dared speak of. But no empire of secrets lasts forever. By now, the police chief La Reynie's investigation had unearthed too much. He had traced powders back to apothecaries, mapped networks of alchemists and midwives, and collected testimonies that pointed again and again to the same modest house in the Rue de la Tannerie. The whispers had grown into a roar. If Paris had a queen of poison, it was Lavoisin. The arrest came suddenly. Soldiers surrounded her home, their boots echoing on cobblestones slick with frost. Neighbours watched in silence as the woman who had held their secrets was led away, cloaked not in finery, but in suspicion. Her household was searched, and from the shadows emerged damning evidence. Bottles of strange powders, vials of unknown liquids, papers scribbled with names, recipes, and symbols that hinted at forbidden arts. Dragged before interrogators, Lavoisin at first remained defiant. She was no witch, she claimed, no murderer. She was merely a midwife, a healer, a woman who told fortunes to those who longed for hope. But La Reynie and his men were relentless. They pressed her on the sudden deaths across Paris, the noble names found among her records, the testimony of accomplices who spoke of darker rituals. And slowly, under pressure, the facade began to crack. Witnesses described black masses conducted in secret chapels, infants laid upon altars, women of high rank whose faces once graced Versailles kneeling in desperation, whispering pleas to bind a lover or destroy a rival. At the centre of it all, Lavoisin, cloaked in the role of priestess of death. Whether these stories were entirely true or magnified by fear, they were enough to ignite panic. For if noble ladies were indeed attending such rites, then the scandal reached far higher than the Parisian underworld. One name in particular sent tremors through the court: Madame de Montespan, the king's mistress, mother of his children, and the woman most envied in France. Whispers suggested that she had sought La Voisin's help to secure the Sun King's love, that she had stood at altars in the dead of night, murmuring incantations while priests consecrated blackened hosts. It was a charge so dangerous, so incendiary, that to speak it aloud was treasonous. La Voisin, however, never uttered it under interrogation. Whether out of fear, loyalty, or calculation, she kept her silence on the most damning secrets. Yet her accomplices were less restrained. Piece by piece, the portrait of Versailles, corrupted by sorcery, took shape. And though Montespan's name could not be proven in open court, it lingered like smoke no wind could clear. The people of Paris followed the trial with morbid fascination. Pamphlets circulated, painting La Voisin as a sorceress, a murderess, a devil's handmaid. Her name became synonymous with fear. Mothers whispered warnings to their daughters. Beware the woman who sold both hope and death. Finally, in February 1680, judgment was passed. La Voisin was condemned to die, her crimes too dark for mercy. On the day of her execution, the square filled with onlookers. They craned their necks to see the infamous fortune teller, the woman whose shadow had reached Versailles itself. Dressed in plain garments, she was dragged toward the stake. The flames rose, devouring wood, cloth, flesh. Witnesses swore that her screams echoed like the cries of the damned, though others claimed she went to her death with defiance in her eyes. By nightfall, all that remained of La Voisin was ash carried away on the wind. But her death did not end the affair of the poisons. If anything, it fanned the flames higher. For in the ashes of La Voisin lay unanswered questions, secrets half-spoken, and names left hanging in the air. And one question above all: if La Voisin had burned, who else would follow? The execution of La Voisin should have marked the end. One woman burned, her ashes scattered, her name blackened forever. Surely the affair would die with her. But the truth was far more dangerous. Her death was not closure, it was ignition. For in the days and weeks that followed, the flames of suspicion leapt higher, consuming nobles, priests, and courtiers alike. La Rainie's files bulged with testimonies. La Voisin's accomplices, whether out of fear, spite, or sheer desperation, had begun naming names. Some whispered of priests who had abandoned the cross to conduct blasphemous masses. Others revealed noble ladies who slipped into shadowed chapels at midnight, their silks trailing in the dust, their whispers trembling with desperation. What had begun as a criminal investigation had now swelled into a storm of accusations that threatened to strip the masks from Versailles itself. The king had no choice but to act, and so, in 1679, the Chambre Ardente, the Chamber of Fire, was established. This special court, held in a darkened hall in the arsenal of Paris, bore a name as ominous as its mission. Its task: to root out poisoners, witches, and conspirators, no matter their rank. The proceedings were terrifying. Witnesses were dragged in, tortured until their tongues loosened, their confessions recorded with meticulous care. Accused women spoke of black powders slipped into wine, of filters poured into soup, of arsenic hidden in perfumed gloves. They described secret masses where consecrated hosts were smeared with blood, where noble women begged for love spells to bind the king himself. Some even confessed to child sacrifices, their voices broken under agony. Were all these stories true, or were they inventions born from fear and torment? History cannot fully untangle the truth, but to contemporaries, the spectacle was enough. Paris lived in terror. Every sudden cough, every unexplained death, was whispered to be the work of poison. Husbands suspected wives, rivals eyed each other's goblets with dread. And slowly, one name rose above the rest: Madame de Montespan. The accusations were never formally proven, yet they could not be silenced. La Voisin's daughter testified that Montespan had visited her mother. Other witnesses claimed that during black masses, Montespan herself had lain upon altars, praying that the Sun King's passion never cooled. The image was grotesque. the most celebrated woman in France, the king's mistress, invoking hellish rites to hold her place at court. Louis XIV could not ignore the whispers, yet he could not bear to see Montespan disgraced. She was the mother of his children, the woman who had once dominated his heart. Officially, her name was kept from the records. Officially, she was never tried, never accused. But unofficially, the poison of rumour clung to her, and her influence at court began to wane. The Chambre Ardente continued its grim work. In total, more than 400 people were implicated. Nobles, priests, midwives, soldiers, and servants, none were beyond suspicion. Some were executed, their bodies burned in public squares. Others were imprisoned for life, their names erased, their crimes buried in silence. A few escaped with their lives, but not their reputations, forever tainted by the whisper of poison. The spectacle horrified Europe. How could the court of the Sun King, the most brilliant in Christendom, also be the breeding ground for sorcery and murder? How could the very women who danced in Versailles' gilded halls also kneel in the shadows of Paris, begging for forbidden spells? Louis XIV, proud and fearful in equal measure, watched as the scandal blackened the glory he had so carefully constructed. Versailles had been meant to be eternal light. Now it was shadowed by fire. And still, the trials did not end. Each confession dragged down another. Each execution opened the door to fresh accusations. The affair of the poisons was no longer the story of one woman's crimes. It was the mirror of a kingdom's corruption. By 1680, the affair of the poisons had spilled far beyond Parisian alleys and into the chambers of Versailles. The Chambre Ardente burned with testimonies, confessions, and accusations that pointed in one direction: the gilded apartments of Madame de Montespan. Montespan was no ordinary mistress. For more than a decade she had held Louis XIV's heart in her jewelled hands. Witty, intelligent, and unafraid to spar with the Sun King himself, she had risen above rivals and secured her place at the pinnacle of Versailles. She bore him 7 children, dazzled his court, and wielded influence like no other woman of her age. But power breeds enemies. Younger beauties arrived at court, eager to capture the king's gaze. And Montespan, proud and ambitious, would not surrender her throne without a fight. The accusations that emerged were shocking. Witnesses claimed that she had turned to la voisin to preserve the king's love. Love potions, whispered incantations, and most damning of all black masses. Imagine the scene as described by trembling tongues under torture. A hidden chapel in Paris, the flicker of black candles, a defrocked priest muttering perverse rites, a naked woman said to be Montespan herself, lying on an altar while prayers were inverted, crosses defiled, and infants' cries silenced forever. Upon her body a chalice was placed, filled with wine and the blood of sacrifice, and over it the priest whispered her desperate plea: "Let the king's heart never leave me." Were these accounts true? Historians still debate. Some believe they were the fevered inventions of broken prisoners, desperate to appease their tormentors. Others argue that Montespan's desperation for power may indeed have driven her to seek such horrors. The truth is lost in the smoke of time. But for Louis XIV, even the whisper of such accusations was devastating. He could not bear to see his beloved mistress dragged through the courts, her name stained in public. Yet he could not entirely ignore the shadows. The Chambre Ardente recorded damning testimony, but Montespan's name was quietly omitted from official transcripts. Justice bent before the power of the throne. Outwardly, she remained unscathed. Inwardly, her grip on Louis began to weaken. The king's eyes turned elsewhere. A gentler, pious woman named Madame de Maintenon began to rise in his favour, offering him the solace of religion rather than the fire of passion. Montespan's days of dominance dwindled. Though she remained at court, she was increasingly isolated, her influence eroded by whispers she could never silence. The scandal struck deeper than Montespan's personal fall. For if the king's mistress, the very woman who shared his bed, was suspected of consorting with poisoners and sorcerers, what did that say of the Sun King's invincibility? Versailles, meant to be the beacon of divine order, had become a stage for rumours of sacrilege and witchcraft. Louis XIV reacted in the only way he knew, with fire and severity. The Chambre Ardente redoubled its work. Suspects were executed, their bodies reduced to ash in public squares. Nobles who had once toasted the king's health now shivered with fear, for even their titles could not shield them from suspicion. A reign built on brilliance was now shadowed by paranoia. And in the heart of Versailles, Louis XIV was forced to confront a bitter truth, that love, power, and ambition could corrupt not only his court, but perhaps even his own bed. The affair of the poisons was no longer a scandal of Parisian fortune-tellers. It was now the darkest chapter in the life of the Sun King himself. The Chambre Ardente was no ordinary court. It was born of fear, named for fire, and fueled by the king's determination to purge his realm of poison. Seated in the arsenal of Paris, its walls darkened with tapestries and heavy draperies, the court exuded an atmosphere both solemn and terrifying. There, behind closed doors, France confronted its most shameful secret. That ambition, jealousy, and desperation had turned its nobles and commoners alike into conspirators of death. Lorraine presided with grim resolve. A man of reason, he sought to cut through superstition, but even he could not deny the enormity of what lay before him. The cases were endless, names piled higher than the court could process. More than 400 suspects were eventually examined. Each confession dragged new accomplices into the fire. It was a chain without end. The methods were brutal. Torture was sanctioned, and under its agony tongues loosened. Accused women spoke of powders hidden in gloves, arsenic mixed with wine, filters slipped into food. Some described midnight ceremonies where candles guttered in the stink of blood, where women of rank begged priests to damn their souls for a lover's devotion. Others, perhaps delirious with pain, spoke of things so grotesque they bordered on nightmare. Infants smothered, their bodies used in potions, their blood mixed with wine for blackened masses. Not all confessions were believed, yet enough threads aligned to weave a chilling picture. France had been infected, not by plague, but by the quiet plague of poison. The very intimacy of murder, the unseen powder in a goblet, the invisible venom on lips made it all the more terrifying. Anyone could be a victim. Anyone could be guilty. Verdicts came swiftly. Many were condemned to die by fire, their bodies consumed in the same flames that gave the Chambre Ardente its name. The people of Paris crowded the squares, eager to see justice or vengeance done. Women who had once walked proudly in silk now stood trembling at the stake, their cries mingling with the roar of the crowd and the crackle of burning wood. But the court was not merely an instrument of punishment, it was also an instrument of silence, for not all names could be allowed to surface. When accusations reached too high, when testimonies touched the king's mistress, or whispered of nobles whose disgrace might wound the monarchy, transcripts were carefully altered. Officially, these figures were never implicated. Unofficially, their shadows lingered. Fear gripped the kingdom. Husbands eyed their wives with suspicion. Servants feared their mistresses. A sudden fever, a faint taste of bitterness in a cup of wine, a rash that spread too quickly, all were taken as signs of poison. The paranoia became so intense that even the king's meals were guarded, his dishes tested before they touched his lips. The Sun King, who had fashioned himself as untouchable, now dined like a man under siege. Yet amidst the fire and the fear, Louis XIV began to see the cost. The scandal that was meant to cleanse his kingdom threatened instead to consume its very soul. Versailles, once the glittering emblem of divine order, now seemed haunted by shadows of betrayal and whispers of witchcraft. By 1682, the Chambre Ardente had grown weary. Too many names, too many accusations, too much fear. The king, desperate to shield his court from further disgrace, began to pull back. Many suspects were quietly imprisoned for life, sealed away in dark cells where their secrets would never again reach the light. The chamber of fire had burned bright, but it could not burn forever. Its ashes, however, would leave scars that no passage of time could erase. By 1682, the flames of the Chambre Ardente had burned so brightly that even the Sun King himself feared the fire might consume his reign. The trials had uncovered horrors beyond imagination, but they had also unleashed a storm of rumour, paranoia, and scandal that threatened to tarnish Versailles forever. If justice continued unchecked, it might devour not just the guilty, but the monarchy itself. Louis XIV made his decision. The chamber was dissolved. Some condemned prisoners were executed, their bodies reduced to ash in public spectacle, but many more, perhaps too dangerous to release, yet too scandalous to expose, were quietly locked away. They disappeared into the darkness of lifelong imprisonment, their names erased from the record, their voices silenced by stone walls and iron bars. The king's hand was deliberate. He had no desire to see the names of great ladies paraded in the streets, nor to hear the court whisper that the mother of his children had invoked sorcery to secure his love. Better to draw a curtain over the horror, to let the embers smoulder unseen rather than risk the blaze rising anew. And so Versailles returned, outwardly, to its glittering rituals. The fountains sparkled, the dances resumed, and courtiers once again fought for the king's smile. Yet beneath the gilded surface, shadows lingered. Too many had been touched by the affair. Husbands remembered wives accused, servants recalled, masters dragged away. Even those who escaped untouched lived in fear that their secrets might one day surface. For Madame de Montespan, the stain could never be erased. Though her name had been spared in official documents, the whispers persisted. She remained at court, but her brilliance had dimmed. The king's favour shifted slowly, inexorably, to Madame de Maintenon, whose piety and calm devotion offered a stark contrast to Montespan's fading glamour. The once dominant mistress, who had commanded the Sun King's heart, now found herself isolated, her power hollow. In time, she would retire to a convent, a queen in exile, haunted by shadows she could never escape. For La Reine, the conclusion of the trials was bitter. He had sought truth and justice, yet found both compromised. The corruption reached too high, the monarchy too fragile to withstand its full exposure. Though he had mapped the veins of poison that coursed through France, he was forced to close his ledger with unanswered questions and suppressed truths. His work had revealed the darkness, but the king's will ensured that darkness was never fully confronted. And for the people of France, the legacy was fear. The affair of the poisons left behind a society suspicious of every gesture, every sudden illness, every unexpected death. The very intimacy of poison, the way it could hide in food, in drink, in touch, created a paranoia that lingered long after the trials ended. For years, Parisians whispered tales of La Voisin and her accomplices, stories that blurred fact and fiction, rumour and reality. The Sun King, who had sought to fashion himself as the embodiment of divine order, had glimpsed how fragile his realm truly was. For all the glitter of Versailles, ambition and desperation had found their way into the heart of his court, cloaked in powders, potions, and whispered prayers. Light and shadow had danced together in his reign, and for a moment, shadow had almost triumphed. The affair of the poisons was not just a scandal, it was a scar, one that revealed the price of power, the corruption of ambition, and the dangers of secrets that smoulder too long in silence. The flames of the Chambre Ardente had been extinguished, the prisons filled, and the records sealed. In Versailles, the Sun King tried to resume his dance of power as if nothing had happened. Yet the world beyond France's gilded walls had watched, and it did not forget. Across Europe, ambassadors carried tales home to their courts. In London, Vienna, Madrid, and Rome, whispers grew into stories that the court of Louis XIV, the most brilliant in Christendom, was infested with sorcerers, poisoners, and women who dared to lay upon altars for unholy rites. To foreign ears, it was both shocking and irresistible. The Sun King, who had crafted his image as a living Apollo, had been nearly eclipsed by shadows born within his own palace. Pamphlets and gossip painted Versailles as a place where perfume masked the stench of poison, where noble women mixed arsenic into their lovers' cups, and where priests in darkened chapels muttered spells for gold. The affair became a cautionary tale, a weapon wielded by France's enemies. They mocked Louis, suggesting that even the Sun King's brilliance could not prevent his own court from collapsing into vice. And yet, the scandal also reinforced the image of Versailles as the theatre of extremes. It was a court of unmatched splendour, but also of unmatched corruption. To outsiders, France was both dazzling and dangerous, a place where beauty and terror lived side by side. The stories of poison and witchcraft became part of the mythology of Louis XIV's reign, feeding the fascination and fear that surrounded him. For the king himself, the memory was bitter. He had survived the scandal, but not unscathed. His reputation as a monarch chosen by God, untouchable and radiant, had been dimmed by the suggestion that those closest to him had trafficked with the devil. Though his power remained absolute, his heart had grown cautious. The glittering feasts of Versailles continued, but behind the laughter lingered suspicion. The Sun King had learned that even light cast shadows. Historians would later struggle with the affair. How much of it was true? How many of the confessions were born not of guilt but of torture? Were the tales of infant sacrifice and black masses grotesque reality or fevered invention? The truth remains tangled. But what cannot be denied is the fear that gripped France, the paranoia that spread like a contagion, and the power of rumour to topple even the proudest courtiers. The affair of the poisons also marked a turning point. It revealed the fragility of monarchies built on appearances. Louis XIV had constructed Versailles as a symbol of order and grandeur, but the scandal showed how quickly appearances could crumble when confronted with ambition, desperation, and secrecy. Even kings could not shield themselves from the chaos of human desire. In the years that followed, Louis XIV sought refuge in piety. He grew more devout, more austere, retreating from the excesses that had once defined his reign. Versailles remained magnificent, but the laughter was quieter, the shadows deeper. Perhaps, in some private corner of his heart, he remembered the whispers that had nearly undone him, the whispers of poison, sorcery, and betrayal. And Europe remembered too. For long after the ashes of La Voisin had scattered, the tale of the affair of the poisons continued to haunt the imagination. It was more than history. It was legend. A story retold in courts and taverns alike. A reminder that even the most brilliant sun cast the darkest shadows. The affair of the poisons ended not with a single moment of resolution, but with silence. The Chambre Ardente was dissolved, its records sealed, its prisoners swallowed by dungeons that would never open again. Officially, the Sun King moved on, his court returning to its glittering rituals, his reign continuing in power and majesty. But the echoes of the scandal never truly faded. The legacy of those dark years lived on in whispers and memory. For the French people, it was a reminder of how fragile life could be, how a single sip of wine, a spoonful of soup, could carry death. For the nobles of Versailles, it was a lesson in fear. Ambition had driven them to fortune-tellers and poisoners, but ambition had also betrayed them. Their silks and jewels had not shielded them from the flames of justice. For Louis XIV, it was a scar upon his reign. He had styled himself as the Sun King, chosen by God, the embodiment of order and divine right. Yet the scandal had revealed the cracks beneath the gilding. Even in the court he had built as a symbol of perfection, shadows thrived, shadows of jealousy, lust, desperation, and betrayal. Montespan, once the queen of his heart, was tainted forever by suspicion. Lorraine, the policeman who had dared to pursue truth, had uncovered too much, only to see his work stifled by royal necessity. Justice had been served selectively, not fully. And for history, the affair of the poisons remains one of the most dramatic scandals of the 17th century. It is a story where fact and rumour blur, where truth hides behind sealed testimonies and tortured confessions. Did black masses truly take place? Did noble women really offer infants upon altars in their desperation to bind love? Or were these grotesque tales born of fear and the agony of the accused? We may never know. But the power of the story lies not only in what happened, but in what was believed. The affair of the poisons teaches us that power is never secure. Even kings, even empires built on gold and light, are vulnerable to the shadows of human ambition. The poison may have been literal in 17th century France, but the metaphor is eternal. Envy, lust, fear, and desperation remain poisons that can corrode families, governments, even entire nations. And so we end where we began, in the glittering halls of Versailles, beneath chandeliers that captured the brilliance of the Sunday. The Sun King reigned, magnificent and unchallenged. But behind the mirrors, behind the masks, there lingered the memory of ashes and whispers, of poisoners who once shook the kingdom to its core. The affair of the poisons is more than a chapter in history, it is a cautionary tale. It reminds us that no matter how radiant the light, darkness always waits at the edges. And it asks us, across centuries, what would you do if desperation whispered in your ear, promising everything you desired at the price of your soul. If this story has held you, if the shadows of Versailles have left their mark on you, don't let it end here. Share this tale, dive deeper into the history that shaped our world, and remember, behind every throne, every crown, every empire, there are secrets waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe, follow, and stay with me because the past is never dead. It is only waiting to be told.